January 12, 1945. The Red Army has begun its great offensive on the Vistula front, and will not stop until it is only 70 kilometers from Berlin, at the beginning of February. During this totally devastating attack, all the German armies defending Poland have been practically annihilated. However, in the midst of so much chaos, hardship, and devastation, there was a German city that resisted isolated in the middle of the Soviet rear for almost 3 months, until the end of the war. This one that we are going to see next, is known as the Siege of Wroclaw, which is one of the greatest examples of Hitler's famous fortress cities, where the Volkssturm also stood out in combat. Thus, this battle for Wroclaw has all the ingredients that define the agonizing fall of the Third Reich during its last months of combat. It all started in August 1944, when the Soviets were stopped at the gates of Warsaw, and the new front was stabilized in the vicinity of the Vistula River. This that we are seeing on the map was the maximum advance of the Red Army during Operation Bagration that they launched that summer. Despite the fact that the city of Wroclaw was some 270 kilometers from the new front line, the German leader gave orders to begin work on defensive structures to fortify the city. Although the exact date on which the Red Army would attack again was not known, it was better to be prepared, and most of the important cities that were in the German rear were declared fortress cities. As we have analyzed in other programs, the objective of a fortress city is to delay the advance of the enemy army as much as possible. This is achieved in the first place by occupying them with a fundamental axis of terrestrial communications, which hinders their logistic system, and secondly, forcing their vanguards to stop before this new obstacle and thus stop advancing. With this it is possible to slow down or stop the enemy advance, which gives time to establish a new defensive line. While this strategy may look effective on paper, in reality it proved disastrous, leading to hundreds of thousands of soldiers being stranded in the Soviet rear, without having much impact on the pace of the Allied advance. Thus, and given the fear of the German soldiers of being isolated and being captured, on most occasions these orders were not complied with, and the different commanders gave the order to abandon said cities when they found themselves overwhelmed by the Red Army. However, this would not happen in Wroclaw. The strategic importance of this city was very high because it was the main axis of the Silesia region, in which there were important German industrial complexes. In addition, it protected the entrance to the north of Czechoslovakia, and made the interior of Germany in the direction of Dresden. At the end of 1944, it is estimated that the population of Wroclaw amounted to about 625,000 inhabitants, which did not stop increasing during the final months of 1944 and the beginning of 1945, with all the wave of refugees that occurred before the advance of the Red Army. When the Soviet breakout occurred on the Vistula front, the city began to receive many people who had to flee, and also soldiers who retreated at full speed to the west. It was approximately on January 22, when the first Ukrainian front Ivan Konev reached the vicinity of Wroclaw. This group of armies formed part of the southern flank of the Great Soviet Offensive, whose center was formed by Zhukov's First Belarusian Front. It was precisely in the center where the greatest advance took place, leaving part of both the Silesian and Pomeranian regions unconquered. In any case, before this advance, a day before on January 21, the order was given to evacuate the largest number of civilians from Wroclaw, and at least 700,000 civilians had to start a very hard march in the direction of Dresden, with freezing temperatures, 20 degrees below zero. It is estimated that 80,000 of them died during the journey. On the other hand, in Wroclaw there was a garrison of about 50,000 combatants, being 35,000 Wehrmacht soldiers and 15,000 Volkssturm militiamen. In addition to these 50,000 combatants, a little over 100,000 civilians stayed in the city, increasing the garrison's demand for food. One of the biggest fears that the Volkssturm had since its formation was that they would not be recognized as regular soldiers by the enemy, and would be considered partisans. This would lead to their immediate execution once captured. Another of their problems was the poor weapons with which they were equipped and their poor training. Thus, due to the advanced age of its members, its precarious material and low mobility, the Volkssturm battalions had a reduced combat value, which made no difference in practically any sector of the front. However, here in Wroclaw, it would not be like that. One of the main objectives that both Koniew and Zhukov had at this time was to reach the Oder River and cross it, to continue advancing towards Berlin, or at least to be able to establish bridgeheads on the western bank. This is something that both the First Ukrainian and Belarusian fronts were able to do during the last days of January, although for this Koniew had to leave Wroclaw behind. It was a few days later, specifically on January 31st, when the Soviet Marshal fixed his gaze on the southern flank and ordered his Sixth Army to conquer the city of Wroclaw. Taking this city would allow him to seize the main axis of the region's highways, and would allow him to improve his logistics system, so he could advance at a higher speed. Koniew thought that the taking of Wroclaw was going to be something routine that was not going to cause greater difficulties than any other city taken previously, and he gave a margin of 4 days for its conquest. The attack was able to begin on February 8th, after a few days of delay due to the collapse of the Soviet logistics system after the frenzied advance, and they needed a few days to gather the necessary troops to take Wroclaw. This first phase of attack lasted from February 8th to 16th, the day the city was completely surrounded. During this final stage, the Soviets found that the German defenses around Wroclaw were very strong, and they had no choice but to surround the city. Although they had planned to take this position in just 4 days, this hard German resistance made their plans fail. The Germans made an attempt to keep a corridor open, with the aim of continuing to evacuate civilians from Wroclaw, but it was closed on the 16th, as we have just said. So from this moment, the siege of Wroclaw began. It should be noted that the Wroclaw flanking operation was not easy for the Soviets, since they did not fight against a static enemy that was defending itself desperately. To tell the truth, the Germans were able to counterattack on several occasions and achieved small victories against the Soviet vanguards. As is logical and natural, this extreme resistance in Wroclaw began to capture all the eyes of Minister Goebbels, who set it as an example to follow in all German cities. After the first 10 days of combat, the Soviet general of the Sixth Army Gluzdovsky realized that his accelerated assault on Wroclaw had failed, and once the city was surrounded, he began to prepare a better coordinated attack against it. The new attack he was preparing consisted of a powerful attack from the south, to be joined by 2 others to the north and northwest of the city. For this, the Soviet general needed to reorganize his forces and accumulate all kinds of material. On the other hand, the Germans wasted no time, and throughout this month of February they sent an elite parachute regiment that reinforced the defenses of Wroclaw, and established an airlift that was able to supply the troops surrounded in the city that were estimated to be about 50,000 fighters of all kinds. The new Soviet attack began on February 22nd and 23rd, supported by strong artillery attacks that little by little destroyed most of the city. Regarding the ground attack, it did not achieve any significant penetration, and after a few days it had to be suspended. The German defenses remained solid. Another Soviet assault took place on March 6th, preceded by an air raid by more than 1,000 bombers that again mercilessly smashed the German defenses. However, again the ground assault was repulsed after losing more than 100 tanks. It should be noted that at this time there were units in which 12 and 13-year-old children were fighting, wreaking havoc with their Panzerfausts. Of course, if the Germans could defend the Oder front with such tenacity, Goebbels claimed that victory was certain. By early March, in addition to launching this failed assault on Wroclaw, the Soviets attacked Pomerania and consolidated their entire right flank. From here, they began to accumulate troops and material for their final assault on Berlin. Meanwhile, Wroclaw had been isolated some 130 kilometers from the new German defensive line on the Neisse River. After the failure of this assault on the city at the beginning of March, the Red Army organized another for April 1st. Again this time they began their attack with a massive artillery attack that ended up destroying 80% of the buildings in the city. After the bombardment, the Soviet armored brigades charged, and this time, they managed to penetrate the German defenses. One of the main achievements of this attack was to seize the German airfield, through which the Germans received their supplies and reinforcements. In addition, the defensive perimeter of Wroclaw was greatly reduced and it was now that of the city itself. However, the Germans were able to contain the Red Army assault, and again destroyed numerous Soviet armored vehicles. Thus, by the beginning of April, the city continued to resist despite being completely isolated and without any possibility of rescue. Needless to say, at this time all German propaganda actions were focused on this heroic resistance. During that month of April, the situation in Wroclaw became even more critical, and food and ammunition became increasingly scarce. Morale was also getting lower every day, and the hell that the soldiers lived there being bombed practically every day began to be unbearable. Luckily for them, once the new Soviet offensive began on the Oder front, there was no major activity in Wroclaw. When they learned of Hitler's death on May 1st, the Wroclaw military commanders understood that their resistance no longer made sense, since negotiations to sign peace were already taking place. Thus, General Hermann Niehoff began a negotiation on his behalf with the Soviet General Gluzdovsky to surrender his garrison with the promise of receiving good treatment for prisoners and civilians. This led to the fact that on May 6 the 20,000 soldiers that remained in Wroclaw ended up surrendering, just a few hours before the official surrender of Germany. During these almost 3 months of combat, the Germans had a total of 29,000 casualties, with 6,000 dead and 23,000 wounded, to which must be added the 20,000 soldiers who were finally captured. On the other hand, the Red Army suffered 60,000 casualties, with 13,000 dead and 47,000 wounded, to which must be added the loss of 125 tanks. Finally, we have to say that it is estimated that this German resistance in Wroclaw allowed more than 3 million German refugees to escape from the Soviets and head towards the interior of Germany. This German defense of Wroclaw is considered a completely anomalous event for that time, as is the last offensive that the Germans launched in Bautzen, with which they achieved that last victory when all was lost. I leave you the program about this Battle of Bautzen in the description, which I uploaded a few weeks ago and which I highly recommend that you see. And well, here is this program. Thank you all for being part of this community, and especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and we'll see each other here as always, next Thursday and Sunday. See you soon.